Welcome to our medals dedication event and gallery unveiling. My name is Ryan Goldsworthy, and as the museum director and the curator of the Rcmi Museum, it's my personal and my professional privilege to dedicate this new medals gallery with all of you here in attendance. As we've all come to know so well, the last 2 years have been tremendously difficult for the arts and culture sector, and it gives me great encouragement and happiness to see so many of you here in person again today. I'm happy to say that the Rcmi Museum is once again in full swing, and we owe that to many of the supporters and those attendees here today. So again, I say thank you. We last hosted a medals dedication event back in 2019 for those who were here. On that day, we dedicated the medal sets of Captain Alfred Hannaford, Brigadier J.K. Lawson, and Captain Homer Brown. Those are the medal sets just to the my right of the new collection here. So 3 years later, we're happy to do this again, and we have some great medal sets to discuss this evening. So today we are dedicating the medal sets and additional artifacts to 4 Canadian Second World War prisoners of war. Approximately 9,000 Canadian soldiers, sailors, and aviators were captured during World War II, with many of them experiencing the worst kind of torment and depravity while held in Axis prisoner of war camps across Europe and in Asia. Hundreds of these Canadians, of course, died in captivity, while all of them experienced the trauma of such brutalizing conditions over several years in some cases. Imagine, if you will, being held for months or even years in Japanese or German prisoner of war camp, living on minimal sustenance or sleep, forced into hard labor, witnessing many of their comrades succumb to such conditions, and possessing no information or even hope from an outside world at war. We are privileged to dedicate 4 of these most notable Canadians this evening. They are, in order, Air Vice-Marshal Lawrence E. Wray, Flying Officer Melvin Garland, Nursing Sister Lieutenant Kathleen K. Christie, and Sergeant George MacDonell. Tonight's proceedings are made additionally special because of the presence of several esteemed guests who will speak to the service records of the 4. Our guests, who I will call to the podium in turn, include John Wright, Chair of the RCAF Foundation, David Garland, son of Melvin Garland, Peter Middleton, the nephew of Kay Christie, and Mike Babin, son of Hong Kong veteran Alfred Babin and the president of the Hong Kong Commemorative Veterans Association. In addition to these guests, we are especially honored by the virtual presence of Sergeant George MacDonell, who, though unable to join us in person, is watching and listening with great interest from the back. Thank you for being with us, George, and to our other esteemed guests, thank you. So for my part as the gallery's curator, I'll provide just a little bit of background to the display and to each individual. And following each section, I'll call on our respective guests to speak for a few minutes. So apart from Kay's medals, which arrived to the museum in 1994, courtesy of Peter Middleton, the other medals and objects have come to the museum only in recent years, from 2019 to 2021. This brings me to our first individual, Lawrence Wray. Born in Toronto, Wray graduated from the Royal Military College, and he entered the RCAF's regular force in 1930. He was a real pioneer in the RCAF. In September 1942, Ray earned his Air Force Cross by saving a Grumman amphibian aircraft in the St. Lawrence River. He jumped in himself and sort of held the line to this aircraft overnight, where he was by himself for 12 hours. Ray was posted overseas in 1943 and assumed the command of RCAF Station Skipton-on-Swale. And in March 1944, this is sort of the pivotal moment in his wartime career, then a group captain and a second pilot aboard a Halifax bomber, Ray was shot down during a raid on Frankfurt, Germany. Ray did survive the crash, but he was taken prisoner into the Stalag Luft III prisoner of war camp. Many of you may recognize the name as the camp made famous by 1963's The Great Escape. So Ray arrived just shortly after that famous escape attempt, and he became the camp leader and the senior Allied officer until the war's end in May 1945. For his leadership and dedication to the men during imprisonment, Ray was made an officer of the Order of the British Empire. On his OBE citation, it is written that, quote, Ray continually, with utter disregard for his own safety, countermanded the orders of the German on behalf of the hundreds of prisoners of war. He was quite an individual. Ray continued to serve in the RCAF post-war, and he was appointed the RCAF's Air Officer Commanding No. 1 Air Division, where he was posted in France until his retirement in 1964. Ray's complete medal set, RCAF identification card, and his ID tags are all on display right there. We thank his youngest daughter, Roberta Heron, for donating her father's collection to RCMI. Roberta could not be here tonight, but she noted at the time of donation that, quote, my two sisters and I are very happy that our father's items have found a good home at RCMI. Here to speak to the RCAF and to the record of Lawrence Wray, please help me welcome to the podium John Wright, Chair of the RCAF Foundation.
Thanks, Ryan. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here tonight. I wear two hats. One that I've been introduced as the chair of the Royal Canadian Air Force Foundation, but I'm also the honorary colonel for the Chief of Defense Staff, so you get a 2-for-1 deal tonight. And rightly so. One of the things that brings me here today, after reading the incredible exploits of the people who are being honored tonight, was the fact that 3 weeks ago tonight I was in Arras in France with my two boys. Both of them are in their 20s, and we were in search of my great uncle Willie. Everybody has somebody who's passed away maybe or fought in the war, but my dad was named after great uncle Willie, and I was named after him with my first name, and William James, my son, was named after him, and he's the one that didn't come home, and he's the one we never found until this past month, and then we went to visit him. And this is the sort of thing where my grandfather was actually in the First World War, served all 4 years in it, if you can believe it, wounded at Delval Wood, but re-signed. I can't believe that he actually signed up again and went with his brother, was actually with his brother until September the 27th when he was killed, in 1918. And it took us 15 years to find where Uncle Willie was. And he may just be a name on a wall, but it was important for us to go there. My wife, however, wonders why I get obsessed over these sort of things, and why I would constantly be involved in trying to bring back history. William Barker's another project that we've undertaken over the last couple of years, or the last few years since 2011, and we're going to be putting statues up in Ottawa and Toronto as a result of what he's done for the Air Force. And I simply answered her the same way I spoke to my sons when we were there, just outside of Arras. And I said, I don't know how they did it. I simply don't know how they did it. I don't know how my grandfather survived 4 years from living the way they did. I don't understand how any of the four of the people being honored tonight were able to do what they were able to do. I can't imagine being on a march from a camp and knowing in your own head that if you don't do the right thing to help them live, they'll be left behind or worse. I don't know how you pull within you, at even a young age, all the exploits and all the things that they do. But here's what I said to her. Unless we do this, unless we do it through the Royal Canadian Air Force Foundation, unless we do it through a dedication like this, unless I take my boys on that journey, which was the once-in-a-lifetime journey, then we don't inspire them to do other things. They think that they can just kind of do anything that they want, but when they reach down and realize that when we went to some of the cemeteries and they're aged 19 and 20 and 17 and 24, those are the kids that put their lives on the line and lost them, but there were others who came back and fought the way they did. And the second part of it was they've got families. The heartbreaking thing for me was to walk into a cemetery and see young men, Canadians, who had been killed a month before the end of the war. And to know that their parents had opened a newspaper that said, "War over," and got a letter a month later. To think of the anguish that the parents and the families went through as these individuals not only served, but then were captured and taken as prisoners, and the genuine jubilation when they were able to come home. So let me conclude on that. I can't really say enough about what each of them have gone through. I can't thank the families enough for having donated what they did. But I can do something about inspiring young people. The Royal Canadian Air Force Foundation came into being officially about a year ago. And it's got a lot of prominent people who are behind it, and we are there to commemorate and to inspire young people to get involved in aviation, not necessarily the RCAF, but aviation, to follow their dreams. And last year we gave out 25 $1,000 scholarships. This year we're giving out 50 of them. Next year 75, and the year after that 100 to coincide with the centenary. I'm here to announce tonight that we have named 4 scholarships in the names of the individuals. 2 of them are being announced today, and the other 2 will follow next Friday when we have a meeting. And each of the individuals will be contacted about it. But I want to take the opportunity to announce the 2020 Air Vice-Marshal Larry Wray RCAF Foundation Scholarship that was awarded today, and also the Melvin Garland RCAF Foundation Scholarship that was also awarded today. I want to tell you a little bit about the people receiving them, and that's the inspiration that these people bring to us. It's the legacy they leave. Awarded the 2020 Air Vice Marshal Larry Wray RCAF Foundation Scholarship was awarded to Benjamin Harbarenko this morning. Benjamin Harbarenko of Ludak, Alberta, studies mechanical engineering at the University of Alberta. He's passionate about new methods of building aircraft and spacecraft, and in his free time builds 3D printable rockets. He plans to join the RCAF upon completion of his engineering degree, and his great-grandfather, Andrew Demko, served in the RCAF during the Second World War as an air bomber. Pretty fitting. He was deployed to England in 1944, returned to Canada in 1945, and he was honorably released, having reached the rank of sergeant. That is the first one. The second one, the 2020 Flying Officer Melvin Garland RCAF Foundation Scholarship is awarded to Grace Wilson. Grace Wilson of Cobourg, Ontario, is heading into her second year at Seneca College in the Aviation Technology program. She has a passion for flight that has been passed down through generations of her family, and turned down offers to engineering programs in order to pursue her dream to becoming a pilot. Her grandfather, Lieutenant Colonel H.T. Wilson, enlisted with the RCAF during the Second World War and continued to serve for many years, retiring from service in 1975. At the age of 96, he and Grace still speak weekly about all things aviation. The other 2 will be announced next week. We have to select them. The jury is doing so. But that's what this ceremony brings to me. the inspiration for people like my kids and others, and young people chasing their dreams. And thanks to all four of the individuals, and particularly the ones that we're mentioning tonight. Thank you for that service, and thank the families for their support, and thank everyone else here in the room for everything that you do. I appreciate it very much.
Thanks for that, John. The RCAF Foundation does a lot of great work. They're working towards a major centennial commemorative project for 2024 that the RCMI will be participating in as well. So thank you for taking this occasion to announce 2 scholarships in honor of Ray and Garland. It means a lot, so thank you, John. It's now my honor to introduce Melvin Garland, his background, before I bring his son to the stage. Standing next to me, fittingly, is actually Melvin Garland's battle dress that he wore when he was shot down and captured in France in 1944. So it's pretty significant that he is, in essence, standing here beside me with his 2 generations of men watching on. It's an impactful moment. So please bear with me as I provide a bit of his biographical sketch, and I think it should provide some more information into who this brave individual was. So, Mel Garland was born in St. Catharines, and he enlisted in the RCAF in 1941. Garland trained at the No. 10 Elementary Flying Training School, which is located at the RCAF Station Pendleton in Ontario. In June 1943, Garland was posted to No. 403 Squadron of the RCAF, which was actually the first of 35 RCAF squadrons to be formed overseas. So it's a very significant squadron in the history of the RCAF. From 1943 to 1944, Garland flew a Spitfire 9 in operations over Northwest Europe. And on the 17th of August, 1944, which was his most fateful day in that conflict, Garland flew a Spitfire 9 during a reconnaissance mission in the Normandy Campaign, and he was shot down by German flak near Caen in France. Garland survived the downing of his aircraft. His life was actually saved by his parachute, and he consequently became a member of the Caterpillar Club, which is a rare distinction only given to pilots who were shot down and then were saved specifically by their parachute. And there's a lot of scrutiny that goes into making sure that this claim is legitimate. So it's actually quite a rare honor, rare distinction that was given to Garland. And we actually have, along with his medal set, his Caterpillar Club membership card, as well as the Caterpillar tie pin. So they're very, very interesting artifacts to be included with the set. So Garland later recalled on these moments as he was being shot down. I think it was best to share his words. Suddenly, my fall was stopped with a quick jolt, and looking up, I saw my chute had opened. On looking down, I was just in time to see my plane explode into the ground. I had bailed out, I think, near St. Pierre, which was 5 miles southeast of Caen, and at that time was in the center of fighting. I pulled my chute half shut in order to reach the ground as quickly as possible in case any German snipers were around. You can imagine the mentality in those moments to be that cognizant to think of that. I landed in a matter of a few seconds in the center of a small field with hay. I released my chute and started to run as fast as I could to the nearest hedge line. When about 10 yards from it, I heard something like, "Halt!" And on looking closely at a small hole in the hedge, I observed a German with a machine gun pointed at me. I immediately stopped and upon his direction went slowly towards him. Garland was then taken prisoner by a German patrol, and he remained in captivity as the Germans retreated. In September 1944, Garland was left behind by the retreating Germans, and with assistance from the French resistance, he traversed through France and all the way back to London by the war's end. Garland's complete medal set, as I mentioned, and his Caterpillar Club memorabilia are on display. It is my pleasure to introduce Mel's son, David Garland, who donated these fine objects to the RCMI Museum. David?
Thanks, Ryan. You pretty much took my entire speech, but that's okay. Actually, no. There's a few details I'd like to add to that. First of all, John, thank you for blowing me away with that announcement. My father was born October 22nd, 1922, and that's important because he would have been 100 years old today, which would have been significant if he'd lived that long. But he was the youngest of two boys, and his older brother got the good names, as my dad would say, John, Jack, Hugh, whereas my dad got Melvin Lloyd, which he never liked. But now that his name is attached to a scholarship, that I just wish he was here today so I could share that with him. It'd be a thrill. But you can imagine that growing up, he lived through the Depression, and when he graduated high school, his only means in his world to success was to go to university. And at that time, it wasn't possible. He didn't have the funds, he didn't have the means. But if he enlisted and he served, then the RCAF would pay for his university. So he saw that as an avenue to basically go to university. So as was pointed out, he enlisted, and through the year and a bit of training, he was in Pendleton, he was in Moncton, he was in Bagotville, and then he took the Queen Mary, which I happened to tour when I was 10 years old in California. That was all stripped down at the time, but he zigzagged across the ocean to England, where he continued his training in the spring of 1944. And one interesting tidbit is he actually almost was appointed to Squadron 412, but that was pulled back. So he then started serving with Squadron 403 on July 4th, 1944. And then I have a very detailed log of each and every day during the month and a half that he was with 403. And you can imagine on June 6th, obviously D-Day had occurred, and the Germans were retreating through the Falaise Gap, and this is what their basic assignments were, is to strafe the retreating troops. They would target the fuel trucks, they would target the supply trucks, basically trying to cripple the retreat so that they couldn't go back to Germany and reform and come back to Europe. So as Ryan appropriately pointed out, on August 17th, 1944, on his third recce of the day, his plane did get hit by flak from the ground. He'd radioed his wingman, Flight Officer Green, that he'd been hit, but he thought he could get back to base. No sooner had he said that when his lights flashed on his instrument panel and his engine started to overheat. So as he climbed to 1,000 feet, he prepared to bail after he shut off the engine so it didn't burst into flames. But what Ryan didn't point out is that when he stood up on the seat and pulled back his crop and jumped, his dinghy strap got caught on the seat, and it promptly stopped him from his exit from the plane. So for that brief few seconds, it probably seemed like days, he was trapped on this plane that was falling out of the sky, and he couldn't figure out why he couldn't go anywhere. So he happened to manage to unhook himself from that, slide down the fuselage, and that's when he pulled the cord and his parachute opened. So as Ryan pointed out, he was captured as a young child. I asked him, I said, Dad, why wouldn't you just turn around and run the other way? And he said, well, if I did that, you probably wouldn't be here today. And there's a couple of data points in the 2 weeks he was prisoner that could have also happened. He was fortunate that he was captured by what I believe was a tank commander or army, because during that time in Caen, if you were captured by the SS, you probably wouldn't have lasted a day. They were killing prisoners just because they didn't have the resources, or they didn't want to take them with them. But this particular tank commander followed the rules of war and basically kept him as a prisoner. Now, it wasn't fun. He, I think, was fed rice and water. They were stored in barns and pig pens when they weren't marching. And each day they marched at least 15 miles a day. And on the last night before they woke up to see the retreating Germans leaving them, it was 25 miles. Now, you can imagine he is a flight officer in flight boots. marching 25 miles a day. And for as long as I can remember, he never wanted to walk anywhere. In the last place he lived, the mailbox was literally 50 feet away, and he'd hop in the car and go get the mail. With only one exception, he didn't mind walking a golf course, as long as there was golf clubs. But in early September, they woke up. The Germans had gone, and they didn't know what to do. Basically, the Allies came zipping through and ignored the prisoners. They just kept going after the retreating Germans, and they made their way through the underground back to London. But the other little tidbit that I found out is that he had captured 3 guards as well. They had three German guards as prisoners that they brought back and handed over. And apparently they were glad to be captured at that time. During his training, he flew a Harvard, he flew a Tiger Moth, he flew an Anson, he flew a Hurricane, and as Ryan pointed out, ultimately flying the Spitfire. And never flew after the war, ever, again, other than as a passenger on an airliner if he was traveling somewhere. My name's David. I'm the youngest of 6 kids. I have 4 sisters, 1 brother. 1 sister passed last year, but the 6 of us have 15 children between us and now 11 great-grandchildren. And I just look back and think, one small twist of fate, and I wouldn't be standing here, and that wouldn't exist. And my son Nathan is here to enjoy this as well. So thank you, Ryan, for everything you do for the museum. Thank you, John, for the fantastic announcement about the scholarship. Really honored, appreciate it, and yeah, thank you. So this is a picture of my father when he landed in London after he'd been a prisoner of war for 2 weeks. So you can see you can see that he looked very malnourished.
Thanks for that, David. And thank you to your family for that kind donation in 2019. We cherish these artifacts as we do your father's record. And I'll say this as I do the other families, Garlands are always welcome at RCMI from every generation henceforth. So thank you again. This brings me to my 3rd individual of the evening of 4. Now, this individual, of course, is very noteworthy in RCMI circles, and I would say transcends into Canadian history for many reasons. This individual, of course, is Kathleen G. Christie. Now, Kate Christie was born on Manitoulin Island, Ontario. She graduated as a registered nurse from Toronto Western Hospital in 1934. So she was already somewhat experienced by the time the war broke out, 5 years later. Christie joined the Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps in November 1940. And in November 1941, Christie arrived in Hong Kong as a part of the Canadian Sea Force, where she served as a nurse at Bowen Road Hospital. Interesting tidbit about Kay as well is when she volunteered for this deployment, the only thing the listing said is that it was for a secretive subtropical destination. So you can imagine sort of the courage of the unknown and what it would become months later. So on Christmas Day in 1941, with the fall of Hong Kong, Christie was taken prisoner by the Japanese army. While in captivity, she continued to provide medical care to other Canadian POWs. In fact, she actually volunteered to go into captivity. The Japanese were going to let her go. She felt a duty to the servicemen, who she often referred to as her boys. While in captivity, Christie also used her hospital trunk as a bed, if you can believe it, an object which we also have in the museum collection, thanks to Peter Middleton. So in September 1943, Christie was released from captivity with 15 other Western prisoners considered to be civilians. Now, the interesting thing about this, of course, is that Christie herself was not a civilian. She didn't consider herself to be one, but the Japanese lumped her into the rest of the group and sent her home at that time. So for her devotion to duty and her overseas service, Christie was awarded the Royal Red Cross Class II decoration in 1945, which was actually only one of 170 awarded to Canadians in the Second World War. Perhaps more notably, Christie was also one of only 2 Canadian nurses ever captured during wartime, which is a remarkable statistic, which I would say elevates her even further into Canadian history as a noteworthy name. She joined the RCMI in 1979, later becoming one of the first women to serve on the Institute's board of directors. And a former RCMI president described Christie as always punctual, immaculate in dress, a dignified and decent lady. Christie's complete medal set, of course, has been rededicated for this evening, as have a number of her personal effects, which go in chronological order from her time at Toronto Western Hospital, all the way through to her post-service life. It's really a great collection. So we're happy, again, to thank the family for those donations, most of which came in 1994, but some of the personal effects have come only recently. So I'm happy to now welcome to the podium Peter Middleton, the nephew of Kay Christie.
Thank you. Well, I might as well just go and sit down because Ryan's pretty much stolen my speech. But just to add a little bit of information. In 1975, I was a young, newly hired customer service rep, and this corner of University Avenue in Dundas was part of my service territory. And RCMI was one of my customers. And I remember quite distinctly that they had on the 3rd floor of the old building one electric IBM typewriter, which I got to attend to about once or twice a year. And of course, little did I know then that 47 years later, I would be standing pretty much in the same spot, talking to you and representing both the Christie family and the Middleton family at this medals dedication event. Now, Kay was born in 1911, and so in 1941, she would have been 30 years old when she boarded the ship with one other nursing sister and 2,000 soldiers leaving Vancouver Harbor with destination unknown, but ultimately arriving in Hong Kong. Now, I'm not sure exactly what the average age was of the soldiers on board the ship, but I'm guessing that most were probably in their 20s, maybe some even as young as 18 or 19 years old. So Kay would have been older than most of the men on board that ship. And Kay never married, and she never had any children of her own. But by the end of the war, she had pretty much unofficially adopted every one of those men. And as Ryan mentioned, as long as I can remember, she always referred to them collectively as my boys. And whenever we heard that phrase, we knew exactly who she was talking about. Now, over the course of time, she was asked frequently to either write about, speak about, or be interviewed about the time she spent as a prisoner of war. And as far as I know, she always obliged, but she always did it with some reservation. And I believe that that was because despite the hardship and discomfort that she experienced as a prisoner of war, she knew that other prisoners of war experienced much worse. And in the case of the Hong Kong veterans, all of whom became prisoners of war, endured much worse. And I think that perhaps this was one of the motivating factors for her to become such an ardent supporter of veterans and for the various veterans associations. And she didn't just join these associations and attend meetings, she got involved. And I know for sure she was on the executive committee of at least one large veterans organization. She also attended many of their meetings and events, and she also, when asked, participated in official government memorial ceremonies overseas in Southeast Asia, and I believe once in Europe. Okay, now a little bit about the medals. I was inspired by one of Mike Babin's Hong Kong Veterans Association Zoom presentations, the one about the prisoner of war correspondence. And that inspired me to open up the K-box once again and sort through it and looking for any war correspondence. And yes, I found some, and which I forwarded to Sam Chu. But what I also found, tucked away in the very bottom corner of the box, underneath some books and papers, and in an envelope, was this medal that you see in the very center here with red, white, and blue stripes. And it was kind of around the same time that I can't remember exactly the circumstances, but I was in touch with Mr. Gregory Loudon, whom I think is here today, but I don't know who. Oh, okay, hi. And through quite a few emails and some mailings, we were able to reunite that medal with the rest of Kay's medals when he informed me that he was actually reframing the medals for hanging in this gallery. So at the same time, as I was rummaging through the K box, as I call it, I came across all of the other hardware and trinkets that you see on the top there. So I asked Mr. Loudon what he thought I should do with those, and he assured me that they would be an important part of the medal presentation. And I think some of them are just medals that she received while as a member of the Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps, and others she received while attending some of the events for the Veterans Associations. And when the organizers created these lapel pins and badges as souvenirs of their event. So I think Mr. Loudon has done a really nice job of posting them there. And I hope that it becomes a sort of a reminder of the devotion to and the service for the veterans that she performed. And now, a little bit about her involvement with RCMI. Again, you stole most of my speech, so I would just like to add that Kay very much enjoyed the time she spent at RCMI, and she liked to host these little dinner parties for friends and relatives on special occasions, and I was certainly invited to a few. The friendship, the camaraderie, and the respect that she found here was very important to her, and especially in her later years. And as a family, one of the last things that we wanted to see happen was to see Kay's medals, left in a box in my basement or in a box in the basement of an archive somewhere. And so we are very pleased to know that they will be hung in such a prestigious venue as the Medal Room at RCMI. And I would just like to add in closing that I know that Kay would be very pleased to know that she is being honored today along with 3 other prisoners of war. And if I heard correctly, I think you said that Mr. McDonnell is watching today?
Yes.
He is? Well, I just want Mr. McDonnell to know that you're still one of Kay's boys. Thank you.
Well said, Peter. Thank you for that. We're very happy to know that Kay would have been delighted with what we put on here today. And as you representing the family, that means a lot. So thank you for that and for your many donations over the years. It's really helped to grow our museum into what it is today. So this brings me to the last individual of the evening. And of course, Mr. Peter Middleton revealed the big surprise, but this, of course, would be Sergeant George MacDonell, who is watching via phone there at the back. This would make him the one surviving individual from the 4 tonight, so we're honored to have you listening here tonight, sir. So George MacDonell was born in Listowel, Ontario in 1922, so he'll be 100 this year. He joined the local militia unit in 1938, and he enlisted age 17 in September 1939 in the Royal Canadian Regiment in London, Ontario. By 1941, MacDonell, at that point, he was a very experienced sergeant and trainer of infantry recruits, which is something to behold as a teenager, was posted to the Royal Rifles of Canada in order to train their enlisted men. By November 1941, MacDonell departed with the regiment for Hong Kong, where he also served in the Canadian Sea Force alongside Kay Christie. During that 17-day defense of Hong Kong, MacDonell distinguished himself by leading D Company in attacks on Japanese infantry and artillery command groups. He was quite a soldier. George was then taken prisoner with the fall of the city, where he survived years of starvation, forced labor, and even torture. While in captivity, George was reportedly an inspiration to the other Canadian prisoners of war, reminding them of their military discipline, their duties, and above all else, that they were only temporarily captives. George was ultimately released at the end of the war in September 1945, alongside 68 Canadian survivors. Upon release, George, who was always an inspiration, resolutely exclaimed to his men, "We must not see ourselves as victims. We are victors. We defied our enemies to the best of our abilities until we were ordered to lay down our arms." In 1946, George was awarded a mention in dispatches for his gallantry during the Battle of Hong Kong. for George's complete medal set, along with his Blazer badge and Hong Kong Veterans patch, are on display here now permanently at the RCMI. We thank George for this donation, a sentiment which was born on the occasion when we last dedicated his CO's medals, J.K. Lawson, in 2019, where he was also in attendance. George, I want to say once again, thank you for being there then and now. You will always be remembered, sir. I share this last quote from George, which was sent to me today from his partner, Sue Beard. George wanted to say to the audience, I'm honored to be associated with such distinguished company. Still in his final days, the most modest person you would ever know. On behalf of George and the other Hong Kong veterans, I would like to invite to the podium Mike Babin, the president of the Hong Kong Veterans Commemorative Association. Mike.
Thank you very much, Ryan. I have to say it's a little bit intimidating to be speaking in front of George at the back of the room, but I'll give it my best shot. As the speakers before me have noted, Ryan has already given away some of the game in his remarks, but at the risk of boring you, I'll just go through what I had already prepared. But before starting that, I'd like to express my profound appreciation and that of the Hong Kong Veterans Commemorative Association to Ryan and to his colleagues here at the RCMI. This is an amazing institution, and the collection that you see here and the collections on the other floors of the RCMI are simply amazing, and true tribute and testimony to Canada's military history. So thank you on behalf of all of us. And it's an honor for me as the president of the Hong Kong Veterans Commemorative Association to be able to speak this evening, particularly because we're not only recognizing George, but also recognizing his colleague Kay Christie and two other outstanding individuals from World War II. And it's a very distinguished group, and I personally am awed by their sacrifice and their service to their country. But I've known George for many years, and as I think Ryan mentioned, he was a colleague of my father, Alfred Babin, who was also in the Royal Rifles of Canada, and a fellow veteran of the Battle of Hong Kong. Unfortunately, only 4 Hong Kong veterans, including George, remain alive today. I'd like to give you a little bit of background on George, speak to the Japanese attack on Hong Kong, tell you something of George's experience as a prisoner of war, and conclude with his life following the repatriation in 1945. And as you heard from Ryan, George was born in August of 1922, so that means in just a very short period of time, he's going to be 100 years old. He would have been very pleased to join us this evening, but his age and health dictated otherwise. And as you've heard, he sends his regards and his thanks for this honor. But although George couldn't be here, his son, Paul McDonnell, Paul, perhaps you can stand up, is here with his wife, Jessica, with his son, Tyler, and his wife, Jennifer, sitting over here. And I'm also very pleased to note that there are several members of our Hong Kong Veterans Commemorative Association here this evening as well. It's terrific to see you all. So George was the only child of a family that had a military background. His father was an Army major. His mother was a nursing sister in World War I. As Ryan pointed out, he enlisted in 1938 in the militia. And then in 1939, when Britain declared war on Germany, all Canadian militia members were turned into regular Army. And George was living with his uncle at the time, and so George became a member of the Canadian Army. His uncle was quite upset at that, and basically told George's commanding officer that he was not to be a soldier. So George didn't want to have anything to do with this. He left the military and immediately turned around, went to a recruiting station not far away, told them that he was 18 years old, and he enlisted in the Canadian Army. And he proved to be an ideal candidate. And by George's own admission, he was not a very good student, and it turned out that the military was an ideal place for George. And within a relatively short period of time, after his enlistment, he was promoted to corporal and then to sergeant, and as you heard, he was posted, eventually sent to Quebec City with the Royal Rifles of Canada. He spent some time on garrison duty in Newfoundland, where he and his colleagues spent the better part of a year and before being transferred back to Quebec. And Quebec is where his journey to Hong Kong and a 4-year odyssey began. Japan had been pursuing its expansionist agenda in Asia for years, and by 1940 it became obvious that the then British Crown Colony of Hong Kong was in its path of domination. In addition to its value as a magnificent seaport, Hong Kong lay on the shipping route between Japan and its oil and rubber sources in Southeast Asia. Great Britain was keen to defend Hong Kong, and even though it was clear that doing so would be most likely futile, given the difficulty of resupply and the lack of military support, nonetheless, in an attempt to bolster the defending forces, the British requested Canada to provide troops, and Canada obliged by committing the Royal Rifles of Canada, the Winnipeg Grenadiers, and their headquarters support staff, about 2,000 men and 2 women, as you've heard, in total. So George and nursing sister Kay Christie began the journey west by train and ship on October 27th, and arriving in Hong Kong on November 16th of 1941. The Japanese struck 3 weeks later on December the 8th, nearly simultaneously with their attack on Pearl Harbor. And with their overwhelming numbers, 50,000 men compared to about 12,000 defenders of Hong Kong, including the 2,000 Canadians, they quickly eradicated Hong Kong's very limited air and naval defense capabilities, powered their way through the mainland part of Hong Kong, and on December the 18th, they crossed the channel to the island of Hong Kong. And this was where they began to encounter stiff resistance from the Canadian and British defenders. Sergeant MacDonell commanded a platoon which was positioned in the center of the island at Wang Nei Chong Gap. Hong Kong is very mountainous and inhospitable from a terrain standpoint, and the fighting there was intense and difficult. And contrary to the general opinion held by the British before the attack, the Japanese were skilled, well-trained, and brave soldiers. Eventually, the Canadians were forced to move to the Stanley Peninsula at the south end of the island. And here, after a pitched battle to regain Stanley Village, George and all of the defenders were ordered to lay down arms. The governor of Hong Kong, Sir Mark Young, had surrendered to the Japanese. So on December 25th, 1941, George's ordeal as a prisoner of war began, an ordeal which was to last for 3 years and 8 months. He and the rest of the Canadian battle survivors were force-marched to North Point Camp on Hong Kong Island, which had been a refugee camp before the war and then a stable. Conditions were simply horrendous, with dead and decomposing bodies of humans and pack animals. No water, next to no food. Malnutrition and dysentery soon followed. 9 months later, the Canadians were moved to Sham Shui Po Camp on the mainland, where conditions were somewhat better, although still far from acceptable. The POWs were put to work repairing and lengthening the runway at Kai Tak Airport, which the Japanese had bombed in their initial attack. The curse of extremely limited rations continued, with men forced to work every day under blazing sun and high humidity. And the POWs began suffering from various tropical diseases, as well as those caused by vitamin deficiencies and malnutrition. In January 1943, George and over 600 other men were shipped to Japan. This was a voyage on what became known as hell ships, and I likely need not describe the horrendous conditions the men were forced to endure during that week-long nightmare. Not only were the living conditions appalling, but the ship was constantly at risk of being torpedoed by American submarines, as it was unmarked and would be considered a legitimate target by them. In fact, an earlier POW shipment had been torpedoed with over 800 lives lost. The filthy, stinking, starving men were offloaded at Nagasaki and transferred to Yokohama POW Camp 3D, one of over 100 such camps across Japan. And George was put to work in the Nippon Kokan shipyard, where he and hundreds of fellow POWs were forced to build ships for the Japanese Navy and Merchant Marine. And in contrast to the sweltering weather in Hong Kong, a tropical climate, the conditions in Yokohama were full-on winter, which the POWs had to endure with completely inadequate clothing and accommodations. The awful conditions did not deter George and his colleagues from attempting to subvert the Japanese war effort. At great risk to themselves, they found ways to sabotage the ships being built, and in so doing succeeded in hampering Japan's war effort. In April of 1945, George was moved again, along with 90 others, this time to Ohashi POW camp in northern Japan, the site of an iron ore mine where they again labored as slaves. Finally, a few days after the American atomic bomb drops on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, George's POW ordeal ended with liberation by the U.S. forces. George likes to tell the story about how, in some ways, the Americans overdid it a bit. They began by dropping food by air and big canisters of food by parachute. And I've heard George many times tell about the fact that canisters were landing everywhere. There was more than enough food after a few days of drops, but some of the canisters landed without a parachute attached to them, and you can imagine the results of that. And he tells a story about one canister that came through one of the huts in the POW camp, and there was fruit everywhere throughout the camp, or throughout the hut. So after 4 years away from home, George arrived in Toronto just before Christmas Day of 1945. So let me stop here and make an observation. By any measure, George's battle and POW experience was a horrific one. But throughout his ordeal, he maintained a positive outlook, and he encouraged his colleagues and those under his command to continue the fight against the Japanese Imperial Army. And they did. And there were several fine examples of sabotage, including the one I mentioned a few moments ago. After his repatriation, George enrolled at the University of Toronto. And although he left to join the Army, he left high school in, I think, grade 10. He completed, in a very short period of time, his entire high school curriculum, and then went on to earn a couple of degrees afterwards. So he worked very hard at university. So he, after his time at university, began a very successful career in business and government. He did not, however, put his wartime experience behind him. Instead, he wrote several books about what took place. And this is one of them. I highly recommend it to you, One Soldier's Story. And George has also written a book called They Never Surrendered, which is basically stories of the sabotage efforts that his colleagues undertook while they were prisoners of war. And these are heartwarming stories in spite of the terrible conditions that these men were under. So not only has he written books, he's spoken to many groups, including large numbers of students through his involvement in the Memory Project. And I should have mentioned a copy of this book was donated to every high school library in Toronto and Mississauga some years ago. George has been interviewed in the media many times and has appeared in several documentaries about the Battle of Hong Kong. He's written and published articles outside of his direct war experience as well about the Canadian economy, the environment, and other topics, with the goal of educating readers and illuminating issues that he believes are important to their future. And he's also been a significant financial donor to organizations that support these issues. Now, if George were here this evening, I wrote this before knowing that George was going to be here virtually this evening. So I'm going to tell you what I think George's message will be. It would be that although the Canadians in Hong Kong were ordered to surrender, they never gave up. As POWs, in spite of appalling conditions that appeared to be hopeless, they continued to fight the enemy and to serve their country. Never give up. It's an important message, and a message that we should all heed. And in a conversation with his son, Paul, Paul said, you know, I can sum up my father by saying that he's a good Canadian. And then he corrected himself and he said, no, he's not. He's a great Canadian. And I agree. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike, for those words. For those who don't know Mike's organization, the Hong Kong Veterans Commemorative Association, they do a lot of great work. We've done a lot with them as well, and we appreciate your continued support and advocacy for this history. So thank you, Mike, for being here, and to George, his family as well. That's a nice surprise to me, so thank you for being here to represent the family. And I'll just conclude here with a few comments. I think everything's been so well said. There's not much more to add. But I just want to sum up by thanking everyone who attended here. To our esteemed guests, especially, it added a lot to the proceedings. A lot of emotional heft as well to have family members in attendance to speak to their ancestors. And we've recorded everything as well, so it'll be uploaded to the RCMI's YouTube channel as well. So many other members and guests who couldn't be here will have the chance to see all of these fine words that were spoken here tonight. So on behalf of the RCMI, the museum, our museum committee, of course, who works tirelessly to assist with such projects, our museum team, it really is a teamwork that brings all this together. So thank you to them and to all of you tonight, and especially to George. Thank you for phoning in. Your presence, sir, made this even more special. So once again, it takes a team, and I appreciate all of your support of the museum and our future projects. So all the best this evening. Thank you.